Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a returning guest, Dawn Gallop. We're going to talk about greenhouses. Some of the nuances in them. Last time we talked about, dealing with goats and chickens and all the other animals and creatures on her homestead. So welcome back, Dawn. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Richard, for having me.
If you could, again, just in case people don't listen to the other interview yet, just give me a brief background on yourself and where people can find you, and then we'll start talking.
Well, I'm Dawn. I'm on YouTube for Dawn Gallop #9 Farms. And I am the mom to 9 kids, and I've been homesteading since 1992.
Wow, 9 kids.
Yeah.
God bless you indeed. That's a lot. That's amazing. Yeah, tell me about your interaction with greenhouses. We talked about, again, other aspects of gardening, but I guess you have a lot of expertise in greenhouses. Tell me a bit about how you started with them and what you learned along the way.
Well, in 1997, I bought the first greenhouse. It was a 6x8, a little teeny one that I got from Finger Hut. I know, everybody laughs now. It was $1,000 back then, but it was wonderful. It worked for many years. In 2014, my husband he built a 20x16 greenhouse, and in the same time frame, I got a high tunnel that was 100x30. And so when I started with all these greenhouses, I was still even using the little teeny one, even though it had completely turned to like almost a dark color where you couldn't really see very well through it, but the sun did penetrate it. But the one we built, the first one, was made with polycarbonate, and then the high tunnel was made with plastic.
Okay. Well, I guess one big question is, so like I live in Texas. A lot of the year, the cold is not the problem. The heat is the problem. So, in winter it does get cold, but me versus someone in a northern climate, is a greenhouse still appropriate for me with modifications?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I originally lived in North Carolina. We've just been in the Upper Peninsula now since last November. So with the greenhouses, what you will notice is a lot of times when you're going to want to have a shade cloth, especially where you're at. And so the shade cloth, we had 70% in North Carolina, and it worked.
Okay, so the shade cloth has a percentage associated with it, and that's the percentage of the sun that it lets through or blocks, or
right.
How is shade cloth rated?
Well, exactly, 70%. So it's blocking out 70% of the sunlight. So when I had a lot of tomatoes in there. So the tomatoes, what you could always tell, like it was time to put the shade cloth on. Usually for North Carolina, though, that was around March, April. You would put on the shade cloth so that because the plants would start turning like a little yellow color, almost like they were just getting too much sun. And I knew right away it's time to put the shade cloth on.
Okay. All right. And then what did shade cloth do for the temperature inside the greenhouse? How much did it improve it?
Well, it lowered it a lot. What I did find with high tunnels, which is, basically it was a large high tunnel. And what I would find is that it would stay cooler. It was basically the same temperature as outside. Honestly, it was 100% the same temperature as outside. Even at night, it would drop down to exactly the same temperature that would be outside. But that, for some reason, they just grew amazing in the high tunnel. Like, even my husband always said, he said, thank goodness we have this high tunnel, because he says if I had to grow outside, it just wouldn't happen.
A high tunnel versus a greenhouse. What's the difference? Just geometry, the material it's made of, or what else?
Well, basically a greenhouse is a solid structure. And the greenhouse, I mean, it doesn't have, and usually it's not, a movable structure or anything like that. But my greenhouse had polycarbonate panels. It had regular 2x4s, the whole 9 yards of floor, everything. And so what would happen is, even though we had the fans in it and, vents, it would get so hot, it would be 120 degrees, say, come June, July. It'd be 120 degrees in there, even with the fan on. So that kind of structure, we only used that at the beginning of the growing seasons. I have all my little seedlings in there. And then once they got to a certain size where they were ready to be transplanted, I would move everything into the high tunnel. And the high tunnel, the sides roll up and down, usually depending on which one you have. One will roll up, one will roll down. So that allows for constant airflow. It also helps the plants.
So in the spring and summer, you would just have the high tunnel open all day and night, or just at night, or what?
Yes, at first in the early part of the summer or late spring, I would roll the sides up every day. Now, but once it starts we would get like late June and July and August, I pretty much left the sides down all the time. And I didn't really have any trouble with critters other than a groundhog. The groundhog would come in there and eat all the beans. And it didn't even matter if I put the sides up. He found a way in because they dig.
Interesting. So I guess greenhouse for starting plants, and then high tunnel is a better season extender, or is it capable of going year round? Like what would somebody need to do with a high tunnel if they're in a moderate or colder climate so that they could grow year round?
Well, they could take thermal cloths and freeze blankets, cover up the smaller area, and that way you can agribon is another word for some of it, and you could cover the plants up, and you could continue to grow. You absolutely could.
Well, I've heard of a thermal mass, barrels painted black with sand in them or water. I mean, what are the ways that you found help you grow when it gets really cold outside and you're using a high tunnel?
Well, most of the time what I would do is I would only grow cold weather crop at that time. So once December usually came, that would be the time frame that I would get a deep freeze, and then that would pretty much wipe everything out that was in the high tunnel. Now, there was times I had already went ahead and planted some collards or turnips, many of the broccoli, things like that, kohlrabi.
Okay, so you were able to grow all. You'd switch over to just winter crops, for December, January, February?
Yeah, I would plant them a little bit before that time frame, but that's when I would go ahead and if I didn't plant something in the high tunnel, like the cold weather crops, that's when December would come around, and that's usually when we would have the real hard freeze. The first freeze wouldn't really matter, but when you got one of those hard, deep ones, it did matter. Because like I say, most of the time the temperature would be the same temperature inside the high tunnel as it was outside. You were just shielded with that shade cloth with the sun, from the sun, a lot of the sun.
But what would you do to get a few more degrees, or maybe tens of degrees more warmth in there in the winter?
Well, like you said, you could do the black barrels for water, to hold that heat in. I never really did any of that because I didn't need to. Now, you can run heaters too. Never ran the heater either. We did run fans.
For people that run heaters, is it crazy expensive, or is it not too bad to just run heaters? And do you run them all day, all night, or you just run them at night, or what do you do?
Yes, it is expensive, especially if you have to use electric. There are pane heaters, and that's what I have now. It's called a hot dog heater that I do have in the greenhouse that I have now.
Okay, so the best way you found is, first plant cold weather crops, and then for a little bit of extra warmth, what is the cheapest and easiest way that you found to help out, a high tunnel so the crops can survive?
As far as agribon cloth, I would put blankets over everything.
So
It's
what,
like
like during the day, the agribond absorbs heat, and then at night it radiates it into the structure, or what? How does it work?
well, the agribon basically protect from frost. Even though those really cold nights, I would just cover things up. But most, like I said, most of the time I was only, and it is North Carolina now. Here lately, temperatures have changed. The agribon would help sufficiently, especially on the cold weather crops.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show. Well, what temperature range have you found cold weather crops are okay in, and what is too cold? What temperatures is that?
Yeah, I can tell you this about 25, 27, somewhere around there. Once it goes down to that, they suffer greatly. They really do lose a lot of their cell wall, and you can tell.
What do you tell homesteaders that are further north? Let's say they're in New York or Michigan or places like that. What can they do to be able to grow all year round, or they just can't?
You can grow the cold weather crops in there. You can grow carrots. You just need to use some freeze blankets or insulate them real well with maybe some pine shavings, especially if you're inside of a high tunnel. Yeah, that you can absolutely do that.
Okay. Do you know people that are, let's say that watch your channel that have used, the barrels or other thermal masses, and have you spoken to people that do that? And if so, what do they report?
Yes. Actually, farmer friend of mine, he would do that every year. He had a little greenhouse, and he would put in 5-gallon buckets full. He had painted them black, and he had filled them up, and they were all lined up and down all the greenhouse, and it worked. He would also put like his ducks and stuff in there too, like smaller ones, like when they were little.
Oh, okay. It was like incubators, you mean, or what?
Well,
no. They would go at night?
Yeah, just like a place for them to be because they're out of the harsh weather. So it would they would be smaller, because like I said, his greenhouse was only maybe about, I don't know, 12 by 15 maybe.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. So what other, by working with high tunnels and greenhouses, what else have you learned that's really important for people that are first, when someone gets their first high tunnel, someone that's listening, what are some things that they should watch for to help make sure they're successful?
Watch for when you first start out, of course, you're gung-ho, everything, you want to get everything planted in the ground. Is what I did was the first time I was like, everything planted in the ground. Just be mindful of where you're placing things, because that you want to do a little rotational as far as don't plant your tomatoes in the same spot every year, because that can build up, cause disease. Another thing is water can be an issue. As long as you have water that you can water the high tunnel really well, because what had happened to me was I actually got a salt buildup and other buildups. I didn't know that at the time. And when the salt buildup, you need to go in and flood the high tunnel, so that basically drench it so that it would get rid of, with rain, how it can wash everything away and it can stop buildup. That's one thing you got to watch for, because that does happen.
Oh, how does the salt buildup occur, and where does it build up?
Okay, so salt can be in anything. Your salt can be in your water, even though the water, whatever, even if it's just a normal thing, like minerals and things like that. And it can just build up over time because, of course, you got to think that if it's not raining inside this high tunnel, there's nothing to wash away buildup. So
okay, so if you're using hard, high mineral content water to water the plants, it's gonna leave residues and build up all over the place with scale inside the tunnel.
Yes. So the plants, they can't grow in a lot, like boron can be one. A lot of the different types of minerals can build up. And that's one thing I did have a problem with. And that's when I switched to growing everything into pots. I actually grew everything in 5-gallon buckets for like the last 3 years.
Huh. What did that do for you? Why was that an innovation? How did that help?
Okay, so what had happened was I had a buildup, and like I said, I had the North Carolina State come out and figure out what the buildup was. They found out that there was a lot of things, different things, and they wanted me to flood the high tunnel. And they wanted me to flood it with so much water that it was never going to happen. And now if you can take your plastic and you can, like, say, take your plastic off in the wintertime or when you're done for the growing season, that if you don't want to continue, if you can afford to take your plastic off. A plastic is very expensive. And when you took the plastic, if you could take that off, then the natural elements, the rain, the snow, whatever, can wash away a lot of this. But they just couldn't happen for me. So I was really depressed over the whole thing because I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And then that's when we came up with the idea of growing in 5-gallon buckets.
Well, again, how did the bucket benefit you? Like, why did it prevent scale? What did it do that just going in the ground didn't do in beds?
Okay, so every year I would use compost and soil that I would get like new bags of soil, or I'd have a delivery of compost, different things like that. So I would mix my own soil up, and I'd put in the 5-gallon bucket, and then I would put the tomatoes in, because I did mostly tomatoes and peppers for production as far as selling at the farmer's market. So I had all these tomatoes and the 5-gallon buckets. Then that way too, the plant was right there in this 5-gallon bucket, a lot more easier controlled. We were able to string them up at the top of the high tunnel. It worked amazing, honestly.
Did it use less soil? Did it require less compost? Because I guess what it would do is it allow you to have a deeper bed, in the bucket, but you wouldn't have to use as much soil laterally. So do you think it saved you on soil and compost usage and all that?
Yes, absolutely it did. And so basically we would put like 5 or 6 holes in the bottom. So my tomatoes would be 16 foot tall. Okay, so 16 foot high.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And they would the tomatoes would penetrate past the buckets. They would grow outside the bucket, and they would go into the high tunnel, ground, which didn't really affect it because, I guess it wasn't getting the concentration of it as it normally would if we did when we had planted things into the ground itself.
I grew tomatoes years ago in like a grow tent, and they took over. I mean, when you grow tomatoes with other stuff, like they're greedy. They would choke out everything else with their roots, and I mean, they were everywhere. It was crazy. They're super aggressive from what I saw.
Yeah, I don't know. I just love tomatoes. I love everything about growing a tomato.
Well, they're very popular, yeah. I just noticed, like I said, they were crazy aggressive, but it was pretty cool. Okay, so you did that in bucket watering. If you had a plant in a bucket, would it need less water? Because again, it's spread over more vertical soil profile than horizontal.
Well, no. A lot of times I needed to water more off. So what I would normally do is I'd go first thing in the morning. I would water everything in the high tunnel. And then after that, I would probably usually sometimes go back and water, because a lot of times once that root ball had completely just basically went through the entire soil, it was nothing left. It needed more water to keep sustaining its life.
Okay. Interesting. I guess that's an unexpected trade-off. Would you put any structures in the bucket? Like, was there to allow drainage? Did you put more granular media in the bottom half and soil in the top half? Like, is there any nuance to, again, what goes into the bucket besides the plant?
You talking about nutrients and stuff like that?
Or maybe like what I pictured is, what if I had a 5-gallon bucket and I, poked a few holes in the bottom so stuff could drain out, and I put maybe medium-sized pebbles in the bottom half and then soil on top of them, and then the plant, plant it in the soil. Would that be any benefit to me versus just filling it up with soil?
No, we never put the rocks in there because honestly, I didn't see a difference of doing that. It could, I guess you could put a piece of like the agrobond down in the bottom, put the soil, the rocks down there, and then that way the excess could drain through the holes, and then you wouldn't lose any of your rocks. You could do that because I have done that before, but I didn't really see no difference as far as that.
Any of the crops you planted didn't do well in buckets for some reason, or do they all do just fine?
Everything did really well. I mean, I even did eggplants in the buckets. I rock.
You know what's cool about having everything in buckets is you can move them around. Like if for some reason you have a plant that's starting to obscure another, maybe you move the one that's getting obscured to the edge of the high tunnel, or one that's more temperature sensitive, you move into the interior. Or if a plant is bending one way too much, you can turn the bucket and then the sunlight will hit it in a different way. So I don't know if you played with any of that, but it seems like that would be another benefit to doing this.
Yes, absolutely. It sure was. The only thing is once these tomatoes, got 16 foot tall and stuff, they were hard to move around. Even though I was trimming them up and everything, they were still hard to move around. We did do that.
What about disease? Does buckets help segregate against disease? Because, multiple plants are not in the same body of soil. They stop at the edge of the bucket for the most part. So did you notice any help there?
Well, aphids was a problem no matter what. At high tunnels, there's like two things that I noticed that can be extreme problems. Aphids and spider mites. Spider mites, oh my gosh, they love a high tunnel.
What do you think that is?
Probably because the heat is drier. They like a dry climate, and I'm assuming that's why they like. But they say the ants cause most of the aphid problems. So you'll have ants that come up and actually put the aphids there, and that they come back and eat the sweetness from the so the ant comes back and eats the aphid too.
It'd be funny if you sang and you said spider mites, does whatever a spider might do. Bad joke. Yeah. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Well, very good.
Horrible.
Do you have, so on your YouTube channel, do you just informally teach as you learn, or do you have any courses that people could invest in, or should they, like, where can people go to learn more from you? Go to YouTube, obviously. But yeah. Again, do you have any formal courses for them, or is it, playlists of videos, or what will they find?
No, I'm not very skilled on the computer as well. Give me anything to cook and plant, but don't ask me to do any computer work.
All right. Well, no problem. So, all right. So what's the name of your YouTube channel again, so people can find it and watch your content? Where can they go? It's
Dawn Gallop at number 9 Farms.
And Gallop is Gallop, right? Okay, and Dawn, Dawn. I just want to make sure because I pronounce names one way, you pronounce it the right way, obviously your way. But for listeners, they may not be able to hear, so that's why I mentioned it.
Okay.
So, okay. Well, Dawn, thanks for coming back again. You definitely have a wealth of knowledge, and what's really cool is you tried lots of things. So that's one big reason I enjoyed talking to you is you're not afraid, and you've had good and bad experiences with a lot of stuff, and I think listeners really will appreciate that. So thank you for coming and doing this podcast again.
Okay, well, thank you, Richard. Talk to you soon.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at FindingGeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.